Hello everyone and welcome to my 1K subscriber Q&A special. To celebrate the fact that I recently passed 1,000 subscribers, now we're almost at 1.3 thousand, so that's really cool. Now before I get to the questions, I just want to say that I actually initially recorded this video with video. Unfortunately, my camera's footage was corrupted, so I just stripped out the mic audio and put B-roll footage on top. So if you notice that the mic quality is a little bit different when I'm reading the questions than what you're hearing right now, that's why. So anyway, with that out of the way, let's get to the questions. Okay, so I'm going to be doing these in the order that they were posted in, and I'll keep the question askers anonymous, but I will put the text of the question on screen so that you know which question's being asked. First question: why isn't there a pet you may pet in your game? Okay, so that's a really good that's a good point. Considering that there are 3 shopkeeper NPCs that are talking rodents in the Necromancer's Tower, excuse me. So I guess I just didn't think about it, within that 30-day time limit I gave myself. But who knows? Maybe the next game, maybe I'll even patch in a petable rodent or critter into the Necromancer's Tower. But I'll definitely keep that in mind for the next game. Thank you for your question. All right, so the next question. Hi, friend. I like your channel a lot. Well, thank you. I wanted to ask your opinion on what would be a good dungeon crawler to start with in this subgenre. I have played some CRPGs like Pillars 1 and 2, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. I know of Etrian Odyssey and of Wizardry 8, and they look quite intimidating. I don't know what would be a good option with maybe a bit of story to make the process easier. Thank you very much. I wish the best for you and your channel. Oh, well, that's very thoughtful. Thank you. Thank you for your question and for your support and everything. So what would be a good dungeon crawler to start with? There's a couple that come to mind. You mentioned Etrian Odyssey being intimidating, and I think your gut reaction with that is probably true. The basic Etrian Odyssey games can be a little bit intimidating, especially if you're not used to the genre. However, there are versions of the first few games. They are remakes called Etrian Odyssey Untold. They're remakes of the DS games that showed up on the 3DS. And those games have a heavier emphasis on story. It's still the same games as those originals, but they added like bespoke characters with their own dialogue and their own personalities and stuff, rather than you making like, a party of kind of nameless, voiceless characters. So if you want more of that sort of like story-driven, character-driven RPG, then I would check out Etrian Odyssey Untold. Beyond that, I think that if you go back to the video I did on Shining the Holy Ark, it's a Saturn game, so you'll need to emulate it unless you somehow own a Saturn and can plop down a few $100s on Shining the Holy Ark. But that game, like I say in the video, it's a lot like Golden Sun. It's very story heavy. Each character, with the exception of like the main character, they're all completely voiced, or not voiced. They all have dialogue and their own storylines and whatnot. So that is a really good one. And I think that gameplay wise, it's probably the least intimidating of the DRPGs that are coming to mind right now. So I think those are good places to start. And yeah, so thank you for your question. Okay, next question is, what is a series you wish to cover in the future? So that is a good question too. Phantasy Star, Metroid, Castlevania, there's so many, Metroidvania and dungeon crawler stuff. I'd love to just talk about the Dark Souls games, Elder Scrolls, Vagrant Stories, so many different things that I can think of off the top of my head. I have plans for some of those. I actually have some of them are like in active development in terms of videos right now. But yeah, I'm not going to make any promises as to which one will show up. I tend to kind of keep my cards close to my chest as to what I'm working on. But, those are some of my favorite games. So obviously those are kind of the games that I would like to cover. And if I do cover them, it will, of course, be in like an angle that is unique to me and unique to my interests in those games and in games in general. Okay, next question. My biggest hurdle and criticism is finding the line between constructive feedback with a negative viewpoint versus a positive one. Video games are complex beasts where you can easily be made a hypocrite with a counterexample, and a quote, "it's not that good," or quote, "it's better than people are saying," can get lost when more polarizing commentaries get more clicks. How do you approach tone in your reviews with regard to negative/positivity? And looks like there's a follow-up question, so I'll tackle this first part first. So that's a really good question, and this is the type of thing that I could do a whole like video. I could actually write like a whole book as to my reasoning for why I take the tone I take with certain games. But the real answer is just like I'm just really uninterested with arguing with people online is a big part of the issue. I like having, fun conversations. That's why I got into talking about games as a job and as a hobby at the same time. So, I'd rather have like a resonant dialogue and find places where we see eye to eye on, even if our opinions on a game are maybe very different or our tastes in games are very different. And, for me, I'm very hyper aware of the fact that I have very strange tastes in games. That's why I made this channel, was to be able to talk about the games and the gaming topics that I really like, that I don't really get a chance to talk about in my day job necessarily. And, I don't have anything necessarily against the idea of hot takes. I drop those from time to time, and I understand from a business perspective why people take that stance. I tend to be hyperbolic, but my hyperbolic statements tend to be like, oh, this is one of my all-time favorite games, or this is one of the best games I've ever played, rather than this is the worst game ever, or I hate this, or everyone's wrong about this game. Two examples I would pick are, I really like Soul Hackers 2 from this year, but I've seen people be like, it's the most disappointing JRPG I've played in like decades. And I just don't see that. Like it's definitely a 7 out of 10 game, but I think that game's awesome. And I feel the same way about Stranger of Paradise. On the flip side, I was kind of conflicted on Elden Ring, even though it was one of the best games I've ever played. What I want out of a Souls game and what I want out of a game in general, some of that stuff was missing or just incomplete in the Elden Ring open world especially, and you can go watch my video on that for more detailed explanation as to why I feel that way. Yeah, I don't know. It's like I am aware of the fact that I really think about games a lot too. Like I really think about, okay, I'm having this reaction to a game. Why is that? I always come away from those thoughts with really nuanced views and realizing that it's not that the game is necessarily bad or a movie or whatever. It's also because, that's just how I'm reacting to it. I really try to be very honest about the fact that like this is how I feel and this is why I feel that way, and there are internal and external reasons why I feel that way. And that's getting really into like I said, I could write a whole book about this, so it's getting into the whole nitty gritty. But from bottom line is I just really like to talk about games, and I like to be very honest and, I don't know, accommodating to and open-minded to other people's opinions. So yeah, that's why I tend to take a more positive approach. Some people, like on the Final Fantasy 11 video, accused me of being too apologetic. Some people wanted me to take a harder stance and say that Final Fantasy 14 is a bad game, or that 11 is better, and that the people who like Final Fantasy 14 over Final Fantasy 11 more are wrong. And personally, I don't feel that they're wrong. I like Final Fantasy 11 more than Final Fantasy 14, but I'm also fully aware that everyone's tastes are different. So I don't really see that as apologetics. I see that as just accommodating other people's opinions. And, that's the vibe and the audience and the culture, so to speak, that I want to cultivate around here. So, if people want me to be mean and hyperbolic and very critical of stuff, they probably aren't going to get that. So, don't expect that. I do it once in a while jokingly, but yeah, I just try to be very accommodating. So yeah, that was a really good question. And the second part of that question was, on that same note, audiences can have expectations for their creators. So I'm wondering if you're scared of being typecast, and if so, what genres do you want to talk about that you haven't had the chance to yet? So, first question. No, I am not worried about being typecast, because if you look at the stuff that I've done on this channel, it's all very different, and it will continue to be very different, and it's not out of like, I don't know what my identity is. I like doing different things. I approach each video as a project. I don't really think of the channel as a project, if that makes sense. Like each video, it's fine to me if each video is different, because that's what I like to do, is what I want to make. The through line, I would hope, is that the thing that is bringing people to the channel is just me and the interest in the things that I make, and the interest in hearing my opinions on stuff and seeing, what's the angle of this video going to be, rather than just being like, I know that Brendan's always going to talk about just this genre or just this game. That's all I'm there for. So yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it. It's not like I'm trying to be defiant and like, you're not going to pigeonhole me. It's literally just like, I don't make things that way. So that's just not what's going to happen with this channel, I don't think. Despite the fact that I've really talked about, a lot of dungeon crawlers and whatnot, there are so many other things that I would like to talk about. So to the second part of that question, a genre that I haven't really talked about very much on the channel would be arena shooters or boomer shooters. So stuff like Doom and Quake and Unreal Tournament. The only reason I haven't talked about that, and the only reason I haven't talked about a game, the ones that I talked about earlier, it's literally just because I just don't have the time, or I don't have the angle figured out yet. I feel like a lot of these games that I like and a lot of the topics that I cover are very popular topics, and it's not like I feel like I need to have the completely new idea every time, but I just need to have an idea that I'm really excited about. Like, I'm not just going to sit down and be like, I really want to talk about Quake, so I'm going to talk about Quake. I have to have a project or an idea that would motivate me to make something. Hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, those are the games, boomer shooters and whatnot are the ones that I haven't really talked about that maybe if I could find a way to do it more, I definitely would. So yeah, thanks for those questions. They were very insightful and very deep. I could talk about some of that stuff for a long time, but okay, so next question. Like a Dragon 7 went from brawler to turn-based RPG. If you were to pivot a current franchise into a dungeon RPG, which one would have a solid foot to stand on and succeed? So, okay. I will say just up front that I think when it comes to dungeon RPGs, especially the wizardry style of dungeon RPGs where it's still turn-based combat, even random encounters, really minimalist dungeon presentation, etc., I actually think that streamlined RPG system can accommodate virtually any setting or property that you can think of. And so I actually think that like you could have an Avatar: The Last Airbender dungeon RPG, or you could have, I don't know, you could have like an Aliens Colonial Marines dungeon RPG. It could work for any of those things. For me, the thing that I've actually thought about a lot, there's two. First is Warhammer 40K. So like I could totally see the squad customization aspects that people really love about the Warhammer 40K franchise. I see that translating really well to the party building gameplay of a dungeon RPG. Like you could have Space Marines or Orcs or Eldar or whatever. And I would want to have the Tau Fire Warriors or something. But anyway, like I could totally see that working as a dungeon RPG franchise or a game. Similarly, I think that the Final Fantasy, and specifically the Final Fantasy Tactics and Ivalice stuff, so, Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy 12, Vagrant Story, that whole world, I think would be awesome as a dungeon RPG. And the funny thing is we kind of got that with Dungeon Encounters last year as a game that was made by a bunch of legacy Final Fantasy developers like Hiroyuki Ito, who did the battle system for, Final Fantasy 4 through, I think, up till 9 at least, and then 12's Gambit system, I should say, did Final Fantasy 8's Junction system. The whole ATB, the active time battle system that we know from Final Fantasy was really his idea. And so he brought that back for Dungeon Encounters and iterated and evolved it in really cool ways, but he set it all in a very streamlined, and even more so than like Wizardry or something, a very streamlined, minimalist dungeon RPG, which was really cool. And then, of course, Nobuo Uematsu arranged the music, which the music itself was just classical tunes redone with electric guitars. And it's not the greatest soundtrack, but it's still, Nobuo Uematsu did it. And we all know that Nobuo Uematsu did the music for all the Final Fantasy games, or not all of them, but many of them. And then the character artists, who I can't remember off the top of my head for Dungeon Encounters, they were also the character artists for the Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced and Advanced 2. So we're almost in the realm with Dungeon Encounters. But, I would want the classic job system. I would frankly want Hitoshi Sakamoto to do the soundtrack, because Sakamoto's soundtracks for Tactics and Final Fantasy 12 and Vagrant Story are just incredible. And Tactics Ogre, just amazing music. He also did some Wizardry stuff. Go figure. every question's got to reference wizardry, I guess. But yeah, so I would want like a Final Fantasy Tactics dungeon RPG. In fact, I even made mock-up screenshots, and I'll post them in the video right now, using Final Fantasy 14 character portraits from Akihiko Yoshida, who also did a bunch of the art for like Tactics and all these other games, Vagrant Story, whatnot, Final Fantasy 14, of course. And then some Final Fantasy 11 models, just plopped them into the dungeon encounter screenshots. And anyway, it's an idea that I really like and I'm really obsessed with. And it's not, I've even toyed with making a fan game, but I don't think I'd ever go that far, but we'll see. Anyway, yeah, so that's the answer to that question. And on to the next one. Congrats, my man. Well, thank you. What are some of your favorite games? Okay. Man, this could also be like a super, super long video or something. So anyone who's watched this channel knows that I love Metroid. Metroid is my favorite video game series. I'd rank most of those games ahead of the majority of games I've ever played. If you push me hard, I'll even have nice things to say about like Other M. Not so much Metroid Prime Hunters, but you know, I think its biggest sin is that it's boring. But anyway, my favorite of the series are Metroid Prime and Super. I really like Zero Mission, and Metroid Dread is really coming up the rankings a lot lately. I played that a couple times. I played that several times this year, actually, because I replay games fairly frequently if I really love them. But yeah, I mean, I can get through most of the Metroid series in just a few hours, so a lot of those are just like an afternoon playthrough for me. And then Zelda, I love the Zelda franchise. You know, I would say that Breath of the Wild is the best game I've ever played, or yeah, the best game ever made, which I put in a different category than from my favorite games. So, but like Breath of the Wild, Metroid Prime, and Super Metroid, you could all make a case for those being number one. I love Wind Waker. That's my favorite traditional Zelda, and I love A Link Between Worlds. And then like other series, just off the top of my head real quick, Dragon Quest, obviously, Final Fantasy, of course, Vagrant Story. I should really do a video on Vagrant Story in the future. Similarly, I should definitely do a video on Morrowind. I actually have a couple ideas for that. I know it's like YouTube's favorite Bethesda game, but I have some ideas that I think are slightly different than just talking about how it's the best one. Because frankly, I love Oblivion, and I really, really like Skyrim too. I even really like Daggerfall, and I haven't played that much Arena, but I've played enough to know that like it's a good game, and I think they're all good games. So yeah, and then Dark Souls, Bloodborne, those would probably be my favorite FromSoft games, along with Kingsfield 4 and Shadow Tower Abyss. You guys know that if you've seen my Kingsfield video. Shadow of the Colossus, Eco. You know, I could go on and on. There's so many games, so many great games that I'm thinking of right now. Doom, Halo, Quake, all that stuff too. So yeah, hopefully that gives an idea of some of my favorite games, which is funny because I don't think I mentioned, Etrian Odyssey, obviously, I love that series. So there you go. There's my requisite dungeon RPG to round out the list. I really should make a video of like, here's my favorite games of all time. That would be a fun one to do. Okay. Any thoughts on doing a Let's Play series on dungeon RPGs? So that's a good question. I mean, I'm open to it if I can find a good angle, as I've said numerous times about some of these other questions. Frankly, it's really not high on my priority list, but it's definitely something I think about. I think I'm more open to the idea of doing like quick looks or short reviews or first impression videos, especially for new dungeon RPGs. I feel like, I could do a series where I go through a wizardry game or, I don't know, Might and Magic or something like that. But those games are cool. I do like those games, but I'm so interested in where the renaissance of this genre has been going for the last few years. And there are some indie devs, especially other solo indie devs like me, who have made some really cool stuff and have some really cool stuff on the horizon that I really would love to show on this channel in some way. So I think that would be a really cool way to do it, would be like a first impressions or even like interviewing the developers or something. So I don't want to give too much of my thought process away because I don't know how much of it I'll actually end up following through on. So, don't take anything I say in this video as like a promise or a peek behind what I'm working on. But yeah, so yeah, maybe Let's Plays. More likely we'll do like reviews or first impression videos, something like that. Okay, and next question. You're given the green light to get your dream composer creating and producing a soundtrack for a game you've always wanted to make. Who is that composer? Okay, so Well, let's do the cheat. The cheating answer is that I would want Kenji Yamamoto, who is one of the composers who's done work on the Metroid franchise, most notably the Metroid Prime trilogy. I might have done stuff on Hunters, I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, definitely for sure Prime 1, 2, and 3, and then some stuff for Samus Returns. So if you played those games, you know what Kenji Yamamoto's music and composition sound like. And so my dream game would be to be the person who makes Metroid Prime 4. And I would have Kenji Yamamoto on that game. My hope is that because Kenji Yamamoto was just a supervisor on Dread's soundtrack and not the composer, that Kenji Yamamoto is the composer for Prime 4. We'll see. I don't know, but that's my hope. As for like my own games that I would want to make, I mean, and I guess also I brought up early Hitoshi Sakamoto doing the Final Fantasy Tactics dungeon RPG idea is an obvious one. And there are so many other like composers that I like. You know, Mick Gordon would be awesome to work with. But if I was going to make my dream game of my own personal IP or what have you, the person that comes to mind is Fumie Kumatani. And she did work on the Phantasy Star Online games, specifically Phantasy Star Online Episode 1 and 2, and Phantasy Star Online Episode 3 Card Revolution on the GameCube. And while I really like the Final Fantasy, so many fantasy words. I really love Phantasy Star Online Episode 3, which was, like I said, the standalone GameCube game. It was a card-based, deck-based strategy RPG. It wasn't a hack and slash dungeon crawler like the other Phantasy Star Online releases. It got a weird mixed reaction, but I'm one of the people who absolutely love it. It was one of my favorite GameCube games, and Fumie Kumitani's work on Episode 3 is phenomenal. In fact, I would say, and a lot of people who even don't like that game would agree probably that that's some of the best Phantasy Star Online music in the whole series, in the whole Phantasy Star series, just period, is in Episode 3. It's so good. It's very it's a little bit more melancholic and atmospheric in some ways. Anyway, yeah, I would pick her to be like the composer on my sci-fi RPG games without question. And maybe Kenji Yamamoto too, actually, now that I've already thought about it. So yeah. Anyway, that's a really good question. Thank you. All right, next question. How do you manage to have the intrinsic motivation to do cool personal projects like this? Wow, that's a really deep question. Okay, so this is another one that I could go on and on about my philosophy on creativity and whatnot. I guess I don't really have a good answer, really. What comes to mind is just this is just what I do. I can't not be making things. Like if you give me enough free time, I'll just come up with ideas and eventually I'll want to work on them. You know, this is my favorite thing to do, really, is just work on stuff, make games, draw, make videos, write. I am relatively decent, I will say, at a lot of those things, and I am curious enough about all of those things to keep wanting to learn and get better at them, and I just love the process of working on stuff. Like, I'm such a process-oriented person when it comes to my creative stuff. You know, sometimes I get caught up in the details, but I just really like working on stuff. It's fun. You could call it like workaholism, but I tend to take a lot of breaks too when I know I need to. It's just that, you know, for some people, their favorite hobby is, I don't know, playing basketball or fishing or something like that. For me, it's just the act of making stuff, and I like trying out new things. So yeah. I mean, if you're looking for advice on how to be motivated, I don't really have much there either, because again, it's just there. It's just this intrinsic motivation. I've always had it, and I don't know. You know, sometimes I'll struggle with executive dysfunction and follow through, and I've definitely had to learn strategies to help me with that. But, you know, like the 30-day dev challenge I did for Necromancer's Tower was a huge learning experience, and learning to let go of expectations and just kind of get out of my own way. But I haven't really thought about how and why I went through that process in that way to create like actionable advice for other people necessarily. Maybe what I would say is, you know, look into those kinds of things if that's what you're asking. Like if you're asking for advice on how, I don't know, like I know that time is such a huge hang up for people. I mean, definitely is for me. And I make time in my day to work on stuff, because if I don't, I get really agitated and depressed. So, sometimes I'll skip playing video games for a night or watching TV or whatever. And once in a while, I'll even take a little time off work if I can afford to do that, to do this stuff. And it's not out of like, oh, I need to get this done for deadline. It's just because, sometimes people take a day off to go fishing. Sometimes I take a day off to draw or work on a video or even just check out an hour early or whatever, So yeah, it is my hobby and it's what I love to do. It's the activity, I guess, that I prioritize most. So yeah, that's how I have the intrinsic motivation, I guess. It's just always there, and I try to make time and schedule my life in a way to follow through on it, because otherwise, I feel bad. Anyway, hopefully that answers the question. It was very deep. I was not expecting a super deep question like that, but yeah, hopefully I gave a good answer. Next question. It seems the games journalism has seen a ton. This is also, I can already tell this is going to be a deep question. It seems the games journalism industry has seen a ton of growth and shrinkage in various ways the last 5 years. That's true. In fact, I'm just going to cut in real quick and say that's the case across all media and also the broader games industry in general, both on the development side, the media side, and by media, I also mean like not just the press, but also like YouTube and Twitch and that sort of thing too. The asker continues. It used to be that if you only lived in California or New York, you had a chance, but it seems working from home and being a YouTuber/streamer has made it easier to, quote, get in. Any tips on someone who's been in the industry through that time period? Okay, well, I guess so for anyone who's watching this and doesn't know, my day job is I am a freelance games journalist. I guess you could say that. I would just say I'm a freelance writer because I do a lot of different things, a lot of it gaming, some of it tech. I started out in 2015, graduated a little early from my college, and I immediately got a job at a place local to me called Digital Trends as a editorial assistant, and I was quickly promoted to a staff writer. And then a couple of years after being a staff writer there were layoffs, as there so often is, and I've been a freelancer ever since. I primarily have been a life hacker and kind of like a permalancer, long-term freelancer situation, but also with GameSpot, Popular Science Magazine, Wired, IGN, Electronic Gaming Monthly, Business Insider, a bunch of different places. That's kind of what the deal is with the freelance career. You hop around and get bylines wherever you can. Anyway, that little resume was just to give you an idea of where I've been and kind of what my job has been since about 2015 now. So to the actual question, what advice do I have for someone to get in? And so to the question asker's point, yeah, it is sort of easier to get started. Certainly the barrier to entry to get started, whether it be YouTuber or a streamer, a podcaster, a blogger, games journalist, whatever you want to be, the barrier to entry has never been lower. The reality is that the availability of work, of jobs, and of money, frankly, has never been lower. And so with fewer full-time opportunities out there and way more people doing this job and either losing their full-time employment or trying to get to a place where, talking about games in some capacity is their full-time job, the talent pool is way larger than it's ever been. And that's going to sound really intimidating, but my advice on that is just get started. Just do it. Start a YouTube channel, start a podcast, start posting articles, share them on Twitter, cultivate an audience in any way you can. Because if you want to do this, that's the thing that's going to get you through. The reality is that you might not be able to do this full time. And if you do, it's going to be really stressful and, you're always going to be on shaky ground. You might lose your job at some point. So if you love talking about games, just do it. And I would also say is to readjust your expectations and readjust your definition of success and failure. I really should do a full video on what the realities of being a full-time video game journalist is, because there's a lot of misconceptions as to what we do and what our job is like and how and why we get paid and how much we get paid, because it is a very up, down and topsy-turvy thing, and you don't make a lot of money and you work weird hours, and it's mostly playing games you don't care about and writing about games you don't care about. It definitely has its... I don't want to make it sound too terrible, because it is a cool job. Absolutely. And I'm not trying to be it's just as bad as being a bricklayer or a pharmacist or something, or, I don't know. But because, people love their jobs, and I feel very fortunate that I get to do what I do, but there's still, lots of negatives associated with the job. So yeah, and part of what I meant though about readjusting your expectations and your definition for success kind of play into that. So first is, if you do get this as a full-time job, if you're one of the lucky folks who do get to do this full-time, like I said, there are going to be a lot of negatives. So don't go in assuming that this is going to be all great, all fun all the time. It's still a job. There are still going to be days that you don't want to work, and there are going to be days where you really don't like what you're doing for the job. And that's also true of being a full-time streamer or a full-time YouTuber. You just go watch any of the many videos of people talking about how burnt out they are, or how difficult the algorithm is to deal with, or how constant changes in monetization, or where the audience is actually engaging with content. Those are really difficult, high-stress things to deal with, especially if it means that your entire income for a month or for the rest of your career changing and in flux. That's a lot of stress to deal with. It's not just chilling out, playing video games all day and laying back and relaxing. It's a lot more stress than I think a lot of people realize, and it's a lot more work than people realize. And then on the other end of that, so let's say you don't get the full-time job, right? I would say to people, do not take not doing this full-time as a failure. A lot of people don't, and it's going to be harder and harder and harder going forward for you to have certainly a stable full-time job. And if you are doing it full-time, you might be doing multiple different jobs like I do. I would say that if you love writing about games or talking about games, podcasting, what have you, do it because you love to do it. And don't do it going in to think, oh yeah, I'm going to make a great living off of this, because chances are you're probably not. At the same time, don't go into this thinking my audience is going to be giant and I need this many followers on every platform, and don't expect to have like these followers, I guess is what I'm saying. Because as much as it's so easy now to cultivate an audience, the audiences that you're going to be getting probably won't be very big. And to break through and be that like in the top, 0.1% of any platform is a lot of work, and it takes a lot of preparation. So if you like to do it, just do it because you like to do it, and then treat the end goal of like a full-time job or being having a big audience as a welcome surprise if it happens. Like, you need to be gentle with yourself, because the chances of that stuff happening are low. They're not impossible, but it's low. The nice thing is that doing it because you love it is way easier to keep going when those hard times, kick in. You're not making any money, or you're not getting the views, or your subscribers are dipping, or whatever. If you're just having fun making stuff, those metrics not being what you want them to be won't be as big of a deal, and you'll be able to push through those hard times. Additionally, if you stick with it, you're naturally going to get better at this. You're going to have more and more work out there. People are going to be more and more aware of you. And so when opportunities come around, whether that be opportunities to join a company or to join agency, or it's just because the right metrics on the algorithm were in your favor, those are all opportunities that are constantly coming around. And if you're putting out good work and you're prepared for it and you're sticking to it, at some point, some of those good opportunities will start to fall into place. They might not take you to 1 million subscribers, but they might take you to 1,000 or 5,000, and it might help you create this thing and maybe even make some money off of it. I don't know. So anyway, at the risk of rambling, because this, I could have like scripted out like a whole answer for this. And like I said, maybe I'll do a video on this at some point, especially from the point of view of someone who's been in the press for so long. That might be cool. So I know if you're interested in that, let me know down in the comments. Hopefully this answered your question. I know it's really rambly, but thank you, by the way. All right, that was a pretty deep one. So let's move on to the next one. Congrats on launching your first commercial game. Thank you very much. This one also has, it looks like a couple different questions, so we'll tackle them one at a time. What makes a good dungeon crawler level, and how can you reduce the visual repetition when levels are limited to grid movement? Okay, that's a good question. So it was more of we went from talking about games journalism to now the other side, we're talking about game dev, very inside baseball stuff. So what I would say is, to solve the quote unquote problem of visual repetition, to reduce it, The answer is pretty simple. Have more clutter and decals, have whether that be sprites or 3D objects, different grass tiles or different rocks or skeletons or chains hanging from the walls or whatever the theme of your dungeon is. Have mushrooms growing that you can scatter around the level to add a little bit of visual variety and break up some of the repetition that way. Have a variety of textures and tiles. So, this wall has a bunch of moss growing on it, and this one has some broken tiles, and this one has discolored bricks. And if you lay them all out next to each other, there's a little bit more of a variety or a flow instead of it being just the same texture repeated on every chunk of wall. And then if you have the ability to, changing the room layout and the geometry of your level will also be really helpful. Have rooms that are octagons or circles or elongated in weird ways rather than them all being squares and rectangles or whatever. On top of that, if you have like a highly specific object in a room, like there's a well, draw that or make it in a 3D model and have it be this very specific, unique object. And maybe there's a tree in another part of a forest that needs to be this unique tree, whatever. Having landmarks and bespoke items in different rooms, even if the dungeon textures are very similar through the whole area. If you have a few objects or set pieces that are very memorable, then it breaks up the environment feeling too samey. On top of that, I would also say that especially if you're doing a 3D game, using fog to obscure the visuals that are out of sight. Think of like the Nintendo 64 or PlayStation 1 games where they couldn't render very far, or stuff like Morrowind. They couldn't render very far, so they just put a bunch of fog out there, but actually it creates a really good atmosphere. Acer Aesthetics, a channel I really like, he talks about how in Kingsfield and Shadow Tower, the darkness of those environments really adds a lot of atmosphere. It also does another really nice thing where it has the player imagining what they can't see. So even if you have a really sparse and barren environment with only a few objects here and there, it doesn't really matter because the fear of the unknown, it makes it feel a lot bigger and a lot more detailed than maybe it actually is. So use those kinds of strategies to break up the repetition and reduce it. Now, with that all in mind, I would also say that visual repetition, especially in a dungeon crawler, isn't actually a problem. So if you're asking this question from the point of view of a developer who is worried about visual repetition in your dungeon and you feel like it's a problem that you need to fix, this is an expected part of the genre, and just how DRPGs emulate the abstraction of a tabletop RPG or an older school RPG. If you go watch the DRPG explanation video, I talk about this quite a bit in that. You want the player to be imagining the stuff that's happening in the dungeon. You don't need to have everything rendered in the game. And that's something that modern games have trained us to think that that's a bad thing. And it's not. It's absolutely not. It's just modern games have the time, the money, and the budget to render everything. And so that's why the games look the way that they do. But a text-based game can still be just as fun and just as engaging as a big AAA title like Destiny or God of War, right? At least I believe so. Just because games nowadays chase visual fidelity and representation, do not take that to mean that tile-based visuals are bad or wrong, low budget. I mean, even that, if that is true, and to an extent, it's also helpful because having a small pool of assets, you're reusing a bunch, it saves time, it saves money, and it helps you get your game done, which is the most important thing. And also, players that like these games, they expect a dungeon RPG to be like this. And in some cases, they might even prefer those repetitive visuals. And that's who you're making your game for. So even if a game that you make gets like a 6 out of 10 on a place like Destructoid, and they say that they hated how the dungeons just repeated the visuals over and over again, if I'm reading that review, I'm going to be like, dude, awesome. That sounds like a game for me. Niche games tend to get lower review scores because the stuff that scores really well is usually the stuff that has the highest likelihood of breaking through to a wider audience, right? Whereas like really niche games might not score as well, might not be as well liked, but those mechanics will appeal to who they're supposed to appeal to. So don't worry whether it's about visual repetition or having your game be too difficult or whatever. If there is an audience for that, they will find your game. Much like I was saying before, if there's an audience for the stuff that you're talking about, they will find your channel or your articles. The same thing applies here. Now, the second part of the question is, how do you deal with balancing a dungeon crawler over the long term when attack/defense numbers start getting way higher? And different classes can have wildly varying stats, like a mage with low defense, making sure everything doesn't one-shot it in the endgame levels. Did you use any tools like Excel to help visualize power curves when tweaking numbers for your game? First off, yes. Use Excel. It makes tweaking power and XP curves really easy. You know, you just have them in the spreadsheet, and you can see the stat differences at a glance. So I would highly recommend using that, or whatever spreadsheet program you prefer. Google Sheets, it's very helpful. Now, that said, similar to the visual repetition, to your question, the first part of your question, balance is overrated, and it's just overemphasized especially by like forum users and certain reviewers. And it's basically almost entirely unnecessary in a single player game, especially like a turn-based RPG where you can grind against weaker enemies to take on stronger bosses and find more gold or better equipment or whatever. Obviously, make sure that your game is playable. You know, you need to make sure that the numbers and the math add up so that the player is doing damage and making progress. But you kind of get to dictate how much of that progress happens. Do you want them steamrolling all the enemies? Do you want them to slowly but surely make their way through a dungeon? Both are totally valid scenarios, but that's more of the question you should be asking. And balance is going to be contextual to what you want the player to feel. Because otherwise, you're going to end up with like this perfect, quote unquote, perfectly balanced game where it's basically impossible for the player to do anything without either artificially holding them back or artificially boosting them, so that they remain within this like finely balanced power curve. And it's going to feel artificial and either not fun, or like the player's going to catch on real quick that, oh, I don't really have a lot of control over this. But if they have a little bit of leeway, I think that's a more interesting way to approach your game. On top of that, like, it's okay for games to be hard. And it is also okay to let players break the game. So don't worry too much about balance. Don't worry too much about visual repetition, especially in a DRPG. But if you are worried about it, hopefully I gave you some strategies to kind of overcome that stuff. So that was also another really big question. These last questions have been really deep. It's been fun though. Thank you everyone so far. We only have a few more left. Okay, so next question. Are there any solo developers out there that you'd love to try co-developing a game with, even if it's just a dream for now? Who would it be? Yes, absolutely. So Damien Crawford, aka Cannibal Interactive. Damien just released Purgatory Dungeoneer. Some other games include, it's 6 random characters in a single floor dungeon. That's the whole game. Damien talks about this on Twitter sometimes, of taking that naming convention of certain manga, like I was a teenage orc that got resurrected in the dungeon and now I'm trying to meet a girl. That's how all of Damien's games are titled, and I think it's hilarious. But yeah, Damien's games and just as a developer, can just strip an RPG mechanic down to its bare essentials and understands how to do that, but also will then take that and blow it up in the most absurd but intricate and brilliant ways that I've ever seen. Some of the games kind of are presented as like jokes, maybe, or like they're supposed to be bad. Like there's Damien Crawford's golf experience, which was made in RPG Maker, kind of like my game, using the MV3D engine. And it's brilliant because it emulates what it feels like to be a golfer for the first time. It's absolutely hilarious. But anyway, so yeah, I would absolutely want to work with Damien Crawford, especially on the mechanical aspects of a game. So if I had the opportunity to do that, I would absolutely jump at it 100%. So yeah, thank you for that question. It was good. Next question is, what are your favorite and least favorite parts of developing a game? Okay, so this one is another one I feel like I could be at risk of running on for a while, so I'm going to keep this one short. My favorite thing about being a game developer is bringing my ideas to life and designing characters, gameplay systems, and that sort of thing. It's the design part and the follow through on the art. I like having ideas and seeing them come to fruition. As far as what is my least favorite part, there are a lot of things like I don't necessarily like I don't like coding. I don't really like learning a new programming idea or whatever. It's just not really what I find fun about this side of things. But the thing I would say is kind of a weird answer, but finding my boundaries, finding what I can't do is very not fun because it's psychologically challenging. So being like, oh, I guess, because of the game engine or my own limited abilities, I just can't do this thing that I want to do. That can be kind of a hard pill to swallow. I'm getting better at it, but it can be very difficult. And the other thing I don't like doing is trying to market my games, like get them out to people and put them on social media. And I don't know. It's just, I think earlier when I was talking about being a project-minded person, like I'm so invested in the process of making the thing that when it's done, it like leaves my brain and I just don't think about it that way. And I'm not really worried about things being successful. I have friends and family members who get kind of frustrated with me about that mindset, but that's just how I am. But yeah, that is definitely one of my least favorite things about being a game dev, which was weird because it doesn't even feel like it's like an extra thing that game devs have to do nowadays, but it's not actually a thing that is involved in the video game making process, if that makes sense. All right, the next question is, how has being a freelance games journalist impacted or influenced you as a game dev? Do you think that there are any overlap between those particular outlets of yours? Yes. I consider game dev to kind of just be the natural next step in evolution of my writing. When I would review games or just play games and think about how I'm reacting to certain things, inevitably I start thinking about like, okay, well, how would I do that? Or how would I use this idea in a game that I made? Or, hey, that's a really cool concept. Why don't more games use that? If I had the ability to, I would make a game like that. So inevitably, you have that thought enough times, you ask that question enough times, I just decided to start following through with it. And also, it's just a kind of a full circle thing, because actually, I started out when I was a kid wanting to make games. And I would like draw on these I would draw levels, and I would have like a booklet of different levels. And so like it might be like a Crash Bandicoot or a Mario or Zelda or something. And I would draw out like levels and dungeons and stuff. And I would have these little paper characters that you could like put on the levels, and there'd be rules. Sometimes it'd be like dice or coin flips. And I actually had this thing in like 5th and 6th grade, or maybe even earlier than that, where I would make these games and the other students in my class would like rent them out and then they would play them. And I was helping my mom move recently, and I found part of one, and I wish I could find more of them. But yeah, that's how I got started with the idea of like making games. And that's that'd be a fun video idea as well. But I learned, it was like when I was like 14 or 15, I was like, oh wow, I started reading PC Gamer and thought, oh wow, you can actually write about video games. And I thought that was really cool too. And then I started listening to podcasts, and so I really got into like the media side of things, and like Mega 64 got me into the YouTube and stuff. So that kind of became my path, especially through high school and into college, was I was doing like a lot of video production and reporting and documentary making. Anyway, yeah, so definitely connected, and definitely an outgrowth of it both inspired me to write, and then the writing re-inspired me to get back into making games again. So yeah. All right. It looks like there's a second question, and I believe this might be the final question, and it is, what video or piece of writing of yours are you most proud of, and why? Okay, this is a good one to end on. So, of the stuff I have published so far, the Wizardry overview is by far my favorite video, just because I really am proud of the editing I did for that. And my favorite article is the interview that I did with 5 different developers making games inspired by Kingsfield and Shadow Tower. Honestly, that's really the kind of work, both actually the Wizardry video and that Kingsfield piece are exactly the kind of work that I have always wanted to do in my career and on YouTube here. And I want to do just tons more of that going forward. And I have some stuff like that planned that I'm really excited about that I'm working on right now. But, we'll see. Maybe one of those projects will soon replace these other 2. Who knows? I always get really excited about the next thing I'm working on. So yeah, and I'm excited to share that stuff with you guys. And with that in mind, I'm really excited that so many of you guys submitted questions. I really appreciate it. I'm Really appreciate that so many of you have been following me and watching my videos, and I am stoked to show you guys what I'm working on next. So thank you everyone for your questions. Thank you everyone for watching and for subscribing. I'll be back soon, as always, with more videos and more articles and whatnot. So keep an eye out on the channel and on the community tab. Until then, take care, and yeah, I'll see you in the next upload.